In programming, we use comments to clarify our code. If, for example, I had a bit of code and I wanted the computer to ignore this, in JavaScript you would use 2 forward slashes. Everything to the right of these forward slashes would then be ignored by the computer. This is called an inline comment. If I had more than one line of code, we could also use forward slash asterisk at the beginning, followed by an asterisk forward slash at the end. This is called a multi-line comment. For the Mac, a shortcut would be to highlight your code and press Command forward slash. Now, commenting is going to be a huge tool for you to understand your code and also for others to read your code. Now let's go back to our JavaScript file that we used to create our web page. I'm going to exit this, and for now I'm going to comment out this code so we won't be needing it. And we're going to go back into booleans. In JavaScript we use something called conditional statements, and the first one is called the if statement. I'm going to declare a variable called temp for temperature and assign it a value of 90. Now I'm going to begin my if statement. This is started with a lowercase if followed by parentheses, and this is going to be our condition in between these two parentheses. Let's say temp is greater than 80. Then I'm going to use curly braces, and this is a block of code that executes as long as this condition is true. Let's say console.log, and it's hot. We're going to add semicolons at the end, keeping that good habit. And what console.log is, it's a method that displays data, which is between these two parentheses, to the console, right here, what we've been using. Now, our variable temp is 90, so 90 is greater than 80, so this condition is true. If the temperature is greater than 80, which is 90, then we're going to use this block of code, and it's going to run it. So let's save this file. Refresh the page, and we get it's hot. Now what if our variable temp was 70 instead of 90? Since this condition will now be false, we'll have to run an else statement. Else, lowercase, followed by curly braces, and this bit of code will execute as long as this is false. If 70 is greater than 80, run this, else run this. So it should run it's cold. Let's refresh, get it's cold. Now some might say 70 isn't cold, so we can also add another statement, and this is called the else if. And we can place this after our first if statement, typing else if, and adding a new condition. Let's say temp is less than 60, new curly braces. Let's take this, place it there, add new bit of code right here. It's nice out. Now this condition runs only if this condition is false. So since 70 is not greater than 80, we skip to else if. Since 70 is not less than 60, we skip this, and we go to our final else statement, which is it's nice out. So far with comparison operators, we've done greater than, also less than. If we want to say something is greater than or equal, we would use a right arrow sign followed by an equal sign. And if we want to say something is less than or equal, it'd be a left arrow followed by an equal sign. We've also used the equal sign as an assignment operator, and this is only what it does. It assigns everything to the right of it to the left. If we want to use equality, we would use two equal signs. For example, 2 would equal 2, and 2 would also equal the string 2. Both of these statements would resolve to true. With strict equality, it's written with 3 equal signs. 2 equals 2. However, 2 would not equal the string 2. So this would return true and this would return false. And that's because with strict equality, it not only has to equal the same value, but it has to equal the same data type. And since this is a string and that's a number, this would be false. Now if we want to say something isn't equal to, we would use an exclamation point followed by an equal sign, meaning these two do not share the same values. If we add an additional equal sign, this means that these two do not share the same values and data type. In JavaScript, we use functions, which are parts that can be reused over and over again simply by calling or invoking the function. So we would start out a function by writing function and the name of it. And this will be the block of code that will run when it's called. And now we're going to call it. We simply do that by typing the function's name, which is example, parentheses, and always closing it off with a semicolon. Now, when we run this, it should console.log hi. There we go. Now these parentheses right here, this is actually where parameters go. So if I had 2 parameters, A and B, and let's say we want A to subtract from B. When we call it, in between these parentheses, these are going to be our arguments. So we could say 5 and 2. So now 5 is the first parameter, and since A is the first parameter, it would go into that, and 2 is the second parameter. We would go 5 minus B, and that should give us 3. We get 3. And we can do a bunch of different things with this. So if we wanted to do a function that divides by 2, and we'll have a parameter of num, and we'll have num divided by 2. And now we can put any number in here that we want to run with this divide by 2 function. Let's say 12. So now 12 is the num, and it would go into here, and it would be divided by 2. We should get, and then we have an error, and that's because we didn't rename and call our function, which would be divide by 2. Save it. And now we get 6. It's important to note that we can put as many different arguments as we want in here, and we can always change it whenever we call our function. It will always just put this argument into these parameters and give us an output based on our argument and our calling of our function. Let's use a conditional statement in our function. Let's rename this to test. And let's do an if statement. If num modulo 10 equals 0, console.log, this is divisible by 10. Else console.log, this is not. So now we have a function test with the parameter of num, and we're going to try 12. So 12 modulo 10 has a remainder of 2, so this can't be 0, so it would run this is not. And we can change our argument as many times as we want. we could do 30, and it is divisible by 10. With functions, we have something called scope. And I'm going to reset all of this. And the first scope is called global scope. This is declared with a var, and then naming our variable and assigning it. So now this is considered a global variable, and this is because it's written outside of the function. You can declare a global variable without a var keyword, and this will just automatically turn it global. However, this can cause unintended consequences for your code running it in the future because it affects your entire JavaScript. So you should always declare your global variables with var. Now for local, this is declared within the function. So you could say var local equals local. If I wanted to run this outside of the function, an error would come up. And this is because, let's test it out, an error. Local is not defined. And that's because it only works within the function. It's created within the function, and once the function ends, it is deleted. If we were to create a global variable, var color equals blue, and we can use that same exact variable within here, var color equals yellow, and now let's call this function, and we will use console.log color. Instead of printing out blue, it should print out yellow. There we go. And this is because even though it's a global variable, local takes precedence over the global within its own function. If we want something to execute a number of times, then we would use loops. And the most common type of loop is called the for loop. Now a for loop has three parts to it, and it goes in between these parentheses. The first part is called the initialization. So I'm going to initialize a variable and assign it 0. Add a semicolon, and the second part is called the condition. So I'm going to say the variable I is less than 10. Add another semicolon, and the last part is going to be the final expression, which is normally used to increment or decrement the variable. So I could say I equals I plus 1. Now, a shorthand way of saying this is actually just I plus plus. It means the same exact thing. And we can also decrement with two minuses as well, which would equal I minus 1. But a shorthand way would be minus minus. And let's increment. From here, we're going to do curly braces, and this is the code that we want to loop through. Let's say console.log is I, our variable. So now, when we run this, it's going to start with I at 0, it's going to run through all of this, then send in 0. Now, right after it sends in 0, it's going to increment by 1. So now it's going to be I equals 1. 1 is less than 10, yes, increment by 2. 2, and it goes through the same thing, and it counts all the way up until 9, because it's less than 10. Let's check this. And see, we get 0 through 9. And you'll notice that it didn't do 0 through 10, and that's because it's less than 10. If we want to say I is less than or equal, it can count all the way up to 10. Let's dig deeper into the first part of a for loop, the initialization. Now we necessarily don't even have to have the initialization in this loop. If we declare our variable outside of it, it will still run the same. Refresh, and we get the same exact loop through. We also could have more than one variable within this. So we could say var I equals 0, and then add a comma to add an additional one. We could say text equals number. And now, within our code that's going to be executed, let's concatenate and add text. Let's save this. And now we get number added to each of them. The second part, the condition, is actually optional as well. We could remove this, and as long as this runs true, it will loop through the entire for loop. And if it's false, it will stop. Now if we actually save this, it will run the loop, but it will continuously run it, and it will actually be unlimited. It will actually break this browser, and if you try this at home, it won't be fun trying to exit out of this. Now, without having it there, a way to break the loop is to say if I is equal to 11, let's break it. And this is called a break, and we're going to explain more on that later. So if we save this, without this there, it should stop before it hits 11. And there we go. And we can change this to any number we want. We could say 5, and the same thing would happen. It would stop if it equals 5, so right before it at 4. The third part, the final expression, is actually optional as well. We could take this out, and we could actually place it inside our for loop at the end of our code right here. So we could say I++ with a semicolon at the end, and the same thing occurs. Now we don't have to increment by 1 every time. Let's say we want to increment by 2. We just do plus equals 2, and let's change our if statement. So if it's greater than 10, we'll break it. So now it's going to increment by 2. And like we were saying earlier, we can decrement, so I minus minus. And now we're just going to change this. So let's say our counter or our initialized variable is going to start at 10. And let's say if it's less than 0, then we're going to break it right there. And there we go, it counts down. Now you'll notice that a trend is we don't actually have to use any of these three parts within the parentheses right here. We could actually take this out and do var I equals 10 right there. Let's take out our text. And now we don't actually have anything inside of the for loop right here because everything is either initialized outside or it's put inside the actual code of our for loop. And we get countdown 10 to 0. Now of course it makes a lot more sense to put it within this for loop because it's a lot less code you're going to have to write. So far we've been using numbers to iterate through. We've been doing 10 to 1 or we're doing 0 to 10, but now we can actually iterate through arrays. Let's clear all of this and clear this. And let's declare, initialize a new array. Square brackets. First item, I'm going to put hat. I'm going to put shoes and cloak. Now, in our three part, the first one is to initialize, say var I equals 0. A condition, we're going to do I is less than our variable array, or r, dot length, and then we're going to increment this. I'm going to console.log, and instead of putting I right here, I'm actually going to put the variable square brackets I. So now, when it loops through this, it's going to start at 0, and it's going to go through the number of items in this array, which is 3, and it's going to increment each time. So when it goes through this, 0 would be index 0 of this variable, and it would be hat, and then it would go through each of them. Hat, shoes, and cloak. The next loop we're going to be talking about is called the for in loop. And the for in loop lets us loop through the properties of JavaScript objects. So if I were to declare a JavaScript object, let's do var fruit, use curly braces, and our first key value pair would be type, apple and we're doing 2 strings and 1 boolean. We're gonna print out our first variable, but we're not actually gonna declare it or initialize it. Then for our for in loop, we're gonna type for a in fruit. So this variable in this fruit, our code block, console.log fruit to the index of a. And now it's going to give us the properties or the values of these properties by saying a in the object of fruit. And there we go, we get apple red and the boolean true. The while loop is another type of loop that runs until the condition is false. So let's declare var I equals 0 and then start our while loop. So it's while and only the condition will go in here. So I is less than 10. So while I is less than 10, console.log I. Now it's important to remember that we need to put in our increment right here. If we don't put in our increment, this will crash the browser again. So let's save. And now it keeps on going until it returns false, then it exits out of this condition and this loop. The do while loop is a variation of the while loop, and this will run the code block once before it runs through the loop and until the condition is false. So we would write that with do, then our code block. So let's say console.log. Let's change it up and do a string number and concatenate that with I. We're going to declare I up here, started at 0. Increment, always remember to increment or else it's going to crash your browser. Then outside of this do while, we're going to do the while right here and the condition. So I is less than 10. So now it's going to run this code once before it's going to start looping through this. Let's save. And there we go. You may have noticed that the while and for loop are incredibly similar. The while loop is basically the for loop without the first part and the last part, so without the initialization and without the final expression. Let's create an array of colors. These 4 colors, and then we're going to declare our counter, or where we're going to start at. We're going to start at 0, and then our for loop. And I'm only going to put the condition in this just to show the similarity. I is less than colors dot length. So the length, the number of items within this array. Then I'm going to, in my code, use colors to the index of I, adding my increment right here. Remember, if we don't add this, it's going to crash the browser. And now this should loop through all of these colors. And now if we just change this to while and took out the semicolons, we'd still get the same exact thing. There we go. So we could just actually copy and paste these right next to each other, and you'll see only difference is these semicolons. And generally with a for loop, it's going to be a lot easier to code because it's less code that you have to write. And that is loops.